Thank you so much for inviting me. And thanks for everyone for being here. I'm really excited to talk about some of our work focused on the global restoration movement and kind of considering how we can use our existing ecological knowledge to design better restoration projects. So I work with the Crowther Lab at ETH Zurich, and my background is in mostly tropical conservation and restoration. I've done a lot of work in Latin America, in Costa Rica, and in Mexico. And I joined the Crowther Lab 2 years ago now, and to kind of work with them on building a group on restoration ecology. And the Crowther Lab is a pretty incredibly disciplinary group. It's very rare that an academic institution has a lab that works across basically every single ecological field within the same group. So we have data scientists that solely focus on data analysis. We have theoretical ecologists. We have a communications team, and then there's kind of everything in between. And then the kind of more applied side of things is restoration ecology. And my colleagues there, Dr. Daisy Dent, Caro Bello, and Rebecca Cole, and I all work together on some restoration topics. And I'm going to give just an overview of that, and then basically end with a tool that the Crowther Lab created called Restore, that if anyone is interested in kind of getting more involved with the global restoration movement, if you aren't already, there's maybe some easy ways to kind of connect with projects through that. To follow up on that, I wanted to basically talk about the fact that maybe the most important thing that we can do is to protect and manage our existing forests and ecosystems, rather than focusing only on the areas in which we need to restore, because it's really time consuming and expensive to do restoration. So this is a figure that I like a lot. And essentially all of the internal bubbles mean the amount of climate mitigation, so the filled in bubbles are the amount of climate mitigation you can get for $100 US. So you can see that by protecting and managing existing ecosystems, you can actually get quite a lot. But restoring ecosystems, the circle is a lot smaller. So it becomes much more expensive to do restoration. However, the outer circles, these not shaded ones, essentially represent the potential for climate mitigation with the actual approach. So while it's very expensive to do restoration, there is tremendous capacity to draw down CO2 and reduce the impacts of climate change. But first, we just need to make sure that we're prioritizing protection and management before we think about doing any type of restoration. But because we do need to do this restoration, we have some incredible initiatives, such as the Bond Challenge, where organizations and governments around the world have pledged to restore 350 million hectares by 2030. And in order to do this, we need all of ecological and social knowledge that we possibly can to make sure that we're actually doing socially and ecologically responsible restoration. And what we focus on in the lab essentially is trying to help design the best restoration projects and connect organizations so that there's a lot more interchange between them, rather than having people kind of working entirely on their own. Because in order to make this happen, obviously we need to work in big groups and we need to collaborate, and we need to basically just be learning from each other throughout this process, because it's really complicated to restore ecosystems. And one tool that I wanted to mention, and I'll come back to this a bit more at the end of the talk about how you can potentially get involved through this, is Restore. And Restore is an open platform. It's hosted at restore.eco. And basically what it initially created to do was to map conservation and restoration projects around the world, and then also just help them have transparency about the work that they're doing, and then basically also help them to network, so to connect with other projects in their area. So essentially you can go and Restore, it's completely free. And hopefully some of you already know about this, and you can put your projects on the platform and just essentially to show what you're doing. You can have a short description of it, and you can also use this to find other people that are working in your area. So for example, if you dial down closer, this is an example in Costa Rica in this really large scale payment for ecosystem services system, in which farmers are given incentives for restoring and conserving their ecosystems. you basically can find projects in your area. So this would be kind of at the country level or at the state level. But then you can go much more narrowly down into what is happening on the ground for specific projects. And what this platform also does, if you have a project, it basically helps to democratize access to data. So typically, restoration or kind of ecological data sets are typically locked up and kind of hard to digest. And what the lab has done in creating Restore is basically allowed people that are working on the ground to get access to really just general ideas of what's going on at their site from global mapping products. So, for example, at this site, you can see that there are over 5,000 plant species just generally in the area. There are many amphibians, maybe mammals and bird species. And you can look at other things like the climate and then the carbon drawdown potential of different project sites. So this can help with site planning and just getting a general idea of what's happening ecologically in a region. And you also, through this, get access to really high resolution satellite imagery. So you can see, like this image here, kind of what's going on the ground. And also there's time lapses. You can see what's happened in the past. So what my colleague Rebecca Cole and I have done is built on this incredible database that Restore has created and created what we call the Global Experiments Network, or GEN. And what we're doing is helping to work with some of these projects that are on Restore to scale restoration experiments and synthesis projects so that we can kind of create these recipes of best practices for doing restoration and conservation around the world. And we do this in many ways. And just briefly, our main foci so far are looking at the different rates of ecosystem recovery with different approaches, building tools to prioritize the use of best restoration tools for certain contexts, and then also doing a lot of capacity building workshops where we help organizations that need a bit of help designing things like nurseries to understand how they can scale their initiatives and then connect with other scientists and practitioners that are working in those areas. I'm going to go through some of these things just to give some examples of how this work goes, but basically have a network of restoration experiments that we're using across the world. We're also developing kind of indicators, so things that you can measure to understand the outcomes of these projects. And then we're doing a lot of surveys where we're connecting with organizations to understand about their work. So I'll give an example of that. And then finally, the outreach and capacity development that I mentioned to then take all the knowledge that we've learned and then share it out to the world so that people can learn from all of their colleagues that are working in this movement. For those that aren't familiar, restoration basically can typically take two main forms. And we build these into buckets which are assisted recovery versus natural recovery. So assisted recovery would be something such as planted trees, and then natural recovery, which is something that ecosystems have a tremendous capacity to do, essentially is just removing the pressures. So for example, unnatural fires or cattle grazing that were restricting the ecosystem from recovering, and then just letting it naturally recover on its own. But a lot of organizations focus more on this assisted recovery side of things because it's easier to visualize and understand that basically that it works. So we're working with organizations to also compare just natural recovery to their assisted recovery plots. So they install just a control plot where they allow things to recover on its own. And then we help them do comparisons between the two so that they can understand what areas do they maybe need to do some planting of trees, that they need to do some direct seeding, or what areas can they just kind of let the ecosystem recover on its own. And then we're also working with organizations to essentially help them think about other restoration experiments they can try. So we have colleagues that are doing essentially adding additional soil to rewild the microbiome in the soil. We have some experiments where people are adding agricultural waste as just copy waste that's typically not kind of used for restoration, and that can help to jumpstart recovery, but doesn't take as much resources as doing a really large scale implementation on the assisted side. And then we have some more involved experiments. So in areas where you basically need to do assisted recovery by doing some tree planting, we're helping to basically build different diversity mixes of species so that we can understand which ones are potentially best in tropical forest restoration. And so far, we've partnered or interviewed over 200 organizations since we started last year. And we're focusing right now on Central and South America, although this year we're hoping to move into different parts of the world, such as Southeast Asia and Africa, to kind of have a broader scope. But right now, we basically are working just on Latin America because it's still a huge, huge area. And this is where everyone in the restoration ecology group in the Crowther Lab works right now. And I just wanted to mention a bit on some of the survey information that we've had so far, because there's been some really interesting insights from this. So we did a really large scale survey of practitioners across Latin America that are working in restoration and got over 160 responses from 14 countries. And you can see all the countries listed here. And this is a wide range of organizations that are working in conservation and restoration. And what we're doing is just trying to get a snapshot, essentially, of what they're doing, understanding their restoration goals and how that they're evaluating their progress, that we can help them think about potentially how to do this more effectively. And then think about how their practices shift as the projects get bigger, and then also what influences their choice of practices for different interventions. So what we found so far on the left-hand panel, it shows that most organizations are working in tropical forests. This makes obviously sense because of the area in which we're surveying, and that cattle grazing agriculture are the primary causes of degradation. So that's the kind of context of the work. And then most organizations, so on the left-hand side, I'm showing all the different motivations that people have. On the top, you can see that conserving biodiversity is top priority, and also counteracting climate change is top priority. But then when you think about or take a look at what people are measuring, typically the monitoring is focused more on seedling survival and tree growth and much less on biodiversity. So if we want to understand how biodiversity is recovering, we need to think about simple ways that organizations can use to actually measure this. So we're doing some of that work now, but most people really don't have the time or the capacity to do these really complicated biodiversity surveys. So we're working to help them do that. Another really interesting thing that we found is that most organizations are using assisted restoration approaches, but then a lot of them shift to just natural recovery at scale. So what's happening in this figure isn't particularly important, but basically you can see that this natural regeneration, the lightest green, starts to increase once projects get really, really large. And that's really good because people are matching essentially what they do with larger scale projects. And they're thinking about, okay, we don't have to spend all this money doing really complicated tree planting when we don't need to. We can think about just letting ecosystems recover on their own when it's possible. So from what we found really this far from talking to a lot of organizations is that they want straightforward and standardized methods to measure their progress. So that's what we're working on creating now. And that people that are doing restoration in Latin America are using a mixture of approaches, but we really need to think about how to evaluate if assisted restoration is suitable for all cases where it's applied, because it's still the most commonly used approach. So planted trees can be really good in certain contexts, but it's not really necessary all the time. So we're trying to figure out what is best for certain areas and help people figure out how best to do that. So what we've done then is taken all of this knowledge and all the work that we've kind of insights that we've gotten from everyone, and then help them and basically build these capacity building workshops. So essentially, we had a workshop on innovations for restoration, and I'm going to touch really briefly on that later. And then we've done workshops on restoration monitoring, both online and in the field. And then also tree diversity, native tree diversity workshops. Most of these have taken place in Spanish because of where we're working, but we do have them in English too. So if anyone is interested in joining these for their work in the future, please reach out to me because we can add you to the mailing list, because generally we are probably having some more happen this year, although we're not totally sure of the timing. And then I just wanted to touch super briefly on some work that we've been doing recently to try to think about how we can use really simple practices to improve restoration. So what we did is we looked at all these different types of practices that people are using around the world. So this is a map of all the kind of studies that we looked at, where people added things like biochar, which is essentially just ash, mixes of exotic and or economic species with native tree species, thinking about doing high diversity plantings, thinking about planting trees in islands, adding soil to increase the microbiome. And we found that overall, generally, all of these practices usually have really positive outcomes. And these are really simple things that people can use. So all the blue boxes at the top of the figure on the right essentially means that you have a better ecological outcome if you use one of these practices. And very rarely the practices actually lead to a negative or lower impact. So essentially, these are things that are relatively simple to do, which are just really small tweaks to how people do work that can help to really drastically increase carbon accumulation and things like biodiversity. So we're working on some best practices for how people can work this into mostly forest restoration, but also branching out into some kind of mangrove restoration as well too. And then for a really brief example of this, we've kind of found that things like agricultural waste, so an example of a study where they dumped a whole bunch of orange peels on tropical forest and basically showed on the right-hand side of the top picture, this is the forest regenerating much more rapidly than the left-hand side just by putting some agricultural waste there. And then the same example for dumping coffee pulp on the right-hand side, the faster recovery, and the left-hand side, the slow recovery. So just repurposing some of these resources that we have that maybe aren't used as strategically as we could make some really big differences in restoration outcomes. And we're basically just trying to increase awareness of the potential impacts of these projects, and also then doing some experiments to see what works and what doesn't. And I wanted to end this on potentially some ideas for how you all could get involved more. I know that a lot of people are already working in this space in this room, but if you're interested, I think Restore is a pretty incredible tool for getting a sense of what restoration and conservation is going on around the world. And they're just now starting to build additional features into this. So you can obviously zoom in anywhere on this map here, and you can see what projects are happening near you. But if you want to do a little bit more of a detailed search, you can click on this area, this box right here that says filters. And I think this will get a little bit simpler in the future, but right now this can pop up an advanced search. So you hit advanced site search. And then if you're looking to either volunteer or potentially contribute financially to a project, you can then filter directly by these different types of things that projects are looking for. And then you can type in the country that you're looking in. You can type in a lot of other stuff. This can all just happen, like I mentioned, just by kind of scrolling around the map. But if you're specifically looking for organizations that you could potentially volunteer for, this will help you kind of filter through that. Although there are quite a few organizations that usually take volunteers. So even if they don't mention that specifically on their Restore page, it's certainly worth reaching out to them. But just generally, in addition to potentially putting projects that you're involved in on Restore, if you're looking for basically getting more connected with the restoration and conservation movement, I think this is a really, really nice way to do this in your backyard, just in your general area. And then also if you're thinking about traveling somewhere and doing some good and doing some volunteering, this is a really nice way to just see the network and kind of incredible spread of projects. And with that, I just want to thank everyone.